So this lesson covers the first of your key studies for clinical psychology. You have the classic study by Rosenhan in 1973, and it's called On Being Sane in Insane Places. In order to write up the content from this lesson, you'll need one of the key study sheets, which can be found in LE3 on the side. So please make sure you get yourself the key study sheet, or you have access to paper and a pen to make notes in the same format as you would in the key study sheet if you can't get into the room to get the paperwork. As part of this lesson, there is an extended reading task about Rosenhan and his study. So please can you make sure you've got this to hand throughout the lesson. You can find it on Teams, and if you can't access it on Teams, just pop a message in the chat and I'll send you a direct link. You need to use the extended reading task to add depth and detail to your points. So that's the points about the procedures that Rosenhan used for his research, and also additional points within the evaluation sections. You'll see towards the end of the wider reading task there are extension activities. So you can undertake those if you wish. These are in fact optional. However, please bear in mind that essays in the clinical section can be up to 20 marks, and therefore if you have that access to extension activities and wider reading, you can add and develop your answers in much more depth and detail for those larger extended essays. If you don't have the reading task, please pause the recording, log on to Teams and download the additional information. There is a section on each page for you to make notes. I advise that you read through it first so that you are aware of what you're going to be doing when we write up the study, and then you know which bits of the wider reading you can access quite quickly in order to add depth and detail to the points that we're going to go through. So the first thing that we're going to do is have a look at a video clip that goes over Rosenhan's study and gives you some of the key points, the key features of the study, and some of the issues surrounding strengths and weaknesses of how the study was conducted. Again, please make notes on this as it helps you develop the depth of understanding that you need, and it should therefore ensure that you're approaching this study with a good depth of background knowledge. If the video doesn't autoplay, please can you access it on Teams, and it is called Rosenhan's study, Being Sane in Insane Places.
There's always been madness, but it wasn't until the 19th century that it came to be seen as a disease, to be managed by a new group of experts, psychiatrists. New asylums were built, their walls and bars marking the supposedly clear-cut boundary between the sane and the insane. But in 1887, an enterprising journalist called Elizabeth Cochrane, who wrote under the name of Nellie Bly, challenged this.
Nellie Bly was on a mission to test out psychiatry. So what she did, she checked into a boarding house and she started pulling strange faces and tugging her hair out and saying everyone around her was crazy. And sure enough, it wasn't long before two doctors had her shipped off to the woman's lunatic asylum in New York. Once inside, she behaved perfectly normally, but it made no difference. As she later wrote, the saner I acted, the crazier they thought I was.
Her articles and her book, 10 Days in a Madhouse, showed just how easy it had been to fool the doctors, and just how terrible conditions were inside the asylum.
85 years later, a clinical psychologist called David Rosenhan would do much the same thing.
The 1960s was a time of social and cultural revolution. Established ideas, institutions and professions were questioned, and one of them was psychiatry.
The 1970s were a very turbulent period for psychiatry. At the time, there were a group of psychiatrists, well, in the 1960s anyway, and going through to the 70s, there were a group of psychiatrists who actually badged themselves as anti-psychiatrists.
The medical model saying that this is a largely physical thing, that people have become mentally ill, and the anti-psychiatry movement was saying that perhaps we should see this in a different way.
Thomas Satz argued that psychiatry was a pseudoscience, and the very idea of mental illness was a myth. Irving Goffman suggested that just being in a mental hospital was enough to drive people insane, and R.D. Laing claimed that what psychiatry said was mental illness was just a rational response to an insane world.
What bound them together was objection, the horror at the way that psychiatry was being practiced. In those days, people were largely just incarcerated in big hospitals. I mean, we used to call them loony bins, and in a way, although it's a pejorative, it was like a dustbin for people, really. It's horrible.
It's a space where you can meet with her, where she's not going to be frightened.
R.D. Laing was the most famous of these anti-psychiatrists. It was while listening to one of Laing's lectures that David Rosenhan wondered if there might be a way of actually testing the reliability of psychiatric diagnoses. Can we really tell the sane from the insane? So one evening he called some friends and students and asked them if they'd like to take part in an experiment.
His idea was to see if they could get themselves admitted to hospitals as psychiatric patients, and surprisingly 7 of them, 3 women and 4 men, agreed. One of them, Martin Seligman, now himself a world-famous psychologist, later explained that Rosenhan could be very persuasive. And he had to be, because this was a tough assignment.
I think it'd been very frightening for the pseudo-patients when they turn up. These institutions, very intimidating. They have a certain smell to them. However much you see pictures of them, it's nothing like walking in. It's a physical experience. You really can't put it into words. The smell, the experience, the feeling of the place, it's intimidating.
The would-be patients, none of whom had any history of psychiatric disorder, practiced their roles, including how to avoid swallowing the mass of tablets they'd be sure to be given. They stopped shaving, showering and brushing their teeth, and 5 days later they set off.
And so began one of the most notorious experiments ever conducted in psychology, an experiment from which psychiatry never quite recovered. Rosenhan and his confederates travelled to 12 hospitals in 5 different states in the US. To try to get a more representative sample, some of the hospitals were old, some new, some were short-staffed, others well-staffed. After calling for an appointment, the would-be patients presented themselves at the hospitals. They didn't act crazy like Nellie Bly had done, they just faked a single symptom.
Yes, when the pseudo patients turn up at the hospital, they would just say, I'm hearing a voice and it's saying to me, hollow, empty, thud. And the significance of this is that it doesn't represent any known symptom of a schizophrenic disorder. So it's quite unique, it's made up. No one would have encountered anything like this before.
So Rosenhan was giving the doctors a chance here, and apart from saying they heard the voice and giving a false ID, everything else the pseudo-patient said was true. Significant events in their life were described exactly as they'd been.
And then what happened?
They were all diagnosed as insane and admitted to the hospital.
All of them?
All of them.
Once admitted, the pseudo-patients stopped faking the symptom and behaved in the way they usually did, hence the title of the study, being sane in insane places. When asked by staff how they were feeling, they said they were fine. The symptom had disappeared, and could they please be released? So what was Rosenhan trying to do here?
There were 2 aims to the study. The first one, principally, was to investigate psychiatric labels as to whether these would be used in situations where they weren't appropriate.
So this was first of all a field experiment, the independent variable being the lack of symptoms in the pseudo-patients once admitted, and the dependent variable the responses of the staff. But this wasn't all.
And the second aim of the study was to get some data on what it's actually like to be a patient in a psychiatric hospital.
Being sane in insane places then was also a covert participant observation study of the experience of being hospitalised in a psychiatric ward. So what did Rosenhan and his confederates find? How long would it take for their sanity to be detected by the staff? And what would they find out about life on the inside? How different were the mental hospitals of the 1970s from the madhouse of the 1890s described by Nellie Bly? Despite the fact that the hospitals chosen were not particularly bad ones, and the pseudo-patients behaved quite normally throughout their stay, none of them were ever detected by any member of the hospital staff. And this surprised even Rosenhan.
But I told friends, I told my family, I get out when I can get out. That's all. Be there for a couple of days and I get out. Nobody knew I'd be there for 2 months.
So Rosenhan, with his study on sane and insane places, set out to see if 8 sane people could gain admission into 12 different hospitals. Once admitted, he wanted to know if they would be found out as actually being sane rather than insane. The second aim of his study was also to find out about what the experience of being in mental health institutions in America in the 1970s was actually like. So he wanted to get that qualitative view of what it feels like to be seen as an insane person. So for the main study that Rosenhan conducted, there are 2 elements to what happened during the procedure. So the initial part of the study is the admissions process, which is where the Confederates visited the hospitals and gave their symptoms. So this section of the study is a field experiment. Within that field experiment, the independent variable that was manipulated was the made-up symptoms that pseudo-patients gave to the clinicians who were diagnosing them. The dependent variable, so the aspect of the study that was measured, was the psychiatrist's admission to the hospital of the patient, and also the diagnostic label that was given to the pseudo-patient. So those are the variables that were tested in that component of the study. The second half of the study, which was during the time on the wards, was a participant observation. So once admitted, the pseudo-patients kept written records in sort of diary form of how the ward as a whole operated, how well they were treated, and any other sort of personal reflections they had on their experiences within that ward. So you do need to know that the study is both a field experiment, and you need to know which part of the study was a field experiment, and also which part of the study included participant observation. So one of the things that you have to be absolutely categorically clear on in Rosenhan is that the pseudo-patients themselves were Confederates. They were part of Rosenhan's research team, and they were briefed beforehand. They knew what they were getting involved in, and therefore they were part and parcel of the study. It's quite common to see the pseudo-patients referred to as the sample. They are not the sample. The sample is the hospitals. So please make sure that you underline and highlight the fact that the pseudo-patients are Confederates within the study. So there were 8 in total. 3 of them were women and 5 of them were men, and they took part in this first section of the study. Of the pseudo-patients, 1 was a 20-year-old graduate, and the other 7 were all older and consisted of psychologists, a paediatrician, a psychiatrist, a painter and a housewife. So a number of the Confederates involved were trained and well aware of the processes around mental health diagnosis and hospitalisation, and the others were untrained members of staff. They All used pseudonyms to avoid any diagnosis given later embarrassment. So when they went for diagnosis, the only thing that they changed about their life history and their experiences was their name. It was known at the time that people are often labelled, and therefore if they used their own name, they would have been labelled with a mental health disorder on a permanent level for the rest of their life. So part of the ethical protection of the Confederates was to allocate pseudonyms to help avoid later embarrassment or concerns going forward in life. Those who were in mental health hospitals, so the psychologists and psychiatrists, actually provided a different occupation. So they did that in order to avoid being treated differently and to make sure that there was no suspicion raised by a psychiatrist or a psychologist attending a mental health institution in order to gain a diagnosis of a mental health problem. Rosenhan himself was one of the pseudo patients, and in his case, and only in his case, he notified the chief administrator and the chief psychologists at the hospital. This was to ensure that they knew about him, that they knew he was there, and that if there were any difficulties or issues, he had to just notify the chief administrator and the chief psychologist in order to be able to leave that particular hospital that he was attending. Those two members of staff did not let anybody on the ward know, so none of the sisters and nurses on the ward were aware that Rosenhan was there as a pseudo patient, and the person giving the clinical diagnosis did not know about him. In the case of the other 7 Confederates, none of the hospitals were notified at all that they were attending or that they were on site once they had been admitted. In terms of the sample selected for the procedure, the hospital settings were quite varied, and Rosenhan selected these so that he could generalise his findings as best as possible. So the sample itself consisted of 12 hospitals, and they were located in 5 different states of the USA, and they were varied in the nature and character of the hospitals themselves. So he included both old and new hospital settings, hospitals with good ratios of staff to patients and hospitals with smaller ratios of staff to patients, and he also included private and public hospitals. So the format of the sample selection is independent measures. So each hospital only took part in the study once. The pseudo patients phoned the hospital for an appointment, and they claimed that they were hearing voices. The standardised procedure stated that they had to claim that the voices were slightly unclear, but that they seemed to be saying empty, hollow or thud. So the words were chosen specifically because they're deemed to be words that would place an emphasis on a person's life than their experiences. So, life feels empty, I'm feeling hollow, and so on. Other than that particular aspect of the admissions procedure and changing their name, they gave specific details of their own life whenever they were asked. So they talked about their real life experiences and their families, friends, hobbies and so on, all of which were true to the life that they actually had led. So once the patients had been admitted by the clinician at the admissions procedure, they stopped simulating any symptoms of abnormality and behaved perfectly normally. So this was when they were on the ward, admitted and being supervised by the nursing staff and the clinicians on a day-to-day basis. All of them were given medication. None of them swallowed the medication, so they hid that and threw it away. And also They followed the instructions from staff exactly as instructed. They provided no sort of difficult behaviours, didn't refuse to take part in anything, and they wandered around and chatted to the other patients who were on the ward. Each pseudo patient, as a confederate, was told that they would have to get out of the hospital by convincing staff that they were actually sane. So the only way that they could be discharged from the institution was for staff on the ward to have done their clinical observations of them and decided that they were sane and no longer insane. All of the confederates that had been admitted wanted to be discharged almost immediately, apart from one, which was Rosenhan. They hadn't expected the experience of hospitalisation to be quite as dehumanising and stressful as it actually was when they were there, so they were very keen to get out. So, you know, that had an impact on their behaviour in that they were extremely sane and very compliant to everything they were asked to do. So they behaved extremely well and cooperated fully with all the aspects of hospital life in a hope of getting discharged as quickly as possible. So looking at the results of Rosenhan's first study, not one of the pseudo patients were detected by the staff in the hospital. All staff were under the impression that these confederates were insane and they were treated as such, and nobody came to the conclusion that there was actually nothing wrong with these particular individuals. All apart from one were released with a diagnosis of schizophrenia in remission. Schizophrenia in remission is not actually a clinical diagnosis. Schizophrenia does not go into remission. Schizophrenia itself is a lifelong illness, and therefore the concept of schizophrenia in remission was invalid in terms of a discharge reason. No records by the hospital staff, or no, odd behaviour by hospital staff showed that anybody doubted the authenticity of the patients. So the staff themselves were completely convinced that all of the Confederate pseudo patients were authentic mental health patients. On average, 19 days were spent in hospital. So these ranged from 7 to 52 days, from the moment of admission through to the moment where each of the Confederates was diagnosed as schizophrenia in remission and released back into society. So 52 days was the longest that anyone spent in there, bearing in mind that they were behaving perfectly normally and not showing any signs of mental health issues. Throughout their time in the hospitals and through the sort of review of the information that was gathered, Rosenhan was quite clear that the hospitals were all good or excellent in terms of their understanding and sort of the procedures that they followed for mental health, and he was very clear not to blame any of the hospitals that were involved for their failure to recognise sanity within an insane institution. The pseudo patients reported that they were not very carefully observed, so a lot of the problems they think that led to the sort of long stays in hospitals were not through direct continuous observation of behaviour. So had they been observed in more detail, perhaps the label of schizophrenia may not have stayed for quite so long. The false diagnosis was not applied because of behaviour. Right? They did behave sanely, they did behave perfectly normally, But what happened was a number of behaviours that they did that were normal suddenly became interpreted as insane. So, for example, they had to keep a diary of their experiences on the ward, and a lot of the medical notes referred to random scribblings in a diary, unusual behaviours around note taking and strange activities, secretly writing down in books. So a lot of the information was interpreted as a result of those people being seen as insane from the very outset. However, it was interesting as part of ROSENHAN's study that visitors who came to see patients on the ward and a number of the other patients who had been admitted seemed to know that the pseudo-patient confederates were in fact sane. So during the first 3 hospitalisations, 35 out of 118 patients on the ward said to the confederates that they weren't crazy, they must be a journalist, they must be a professor. So the irony that those on the ward who were actually insane were able to spot those who were not insane, despite the ward staff, clinicians and nurses being unable to spot that, was something that Rosenhan picked up on. And in fact, in his sort of conclusions and recommendations, he's quoted as saying the fact that the patients often recognise normality when staff did not raises important questions. And what he meant by this is, how do we interpret behaviour in a particular context? So going back to the idea of things like note taking, if you are taking notes in a lesson, it is perfectly normal behaviour. However, if I sit you in one of the aisles in Morrison's to take notes, people would interpret your behaviour as abnormal. And the nature of being in a mental health institution by itself meant that normal behaviours suddenly became interpreted as abnormal behaviours. So overall, for this first part of the study, Rosenhan suggested that doctors are more likely to err on the side of caution. So in their defence, you are more likely to call a healthy person sick rather than a sick person healthy. Right? It does partly explain the findings of the initial diagnosis, and that most of the pseudo patients were admitted with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, because ultimately it's quite a serious disorder. Hearing voices is part of schizophrenia, but it's not sufficient on its own to diagnose schizophrenia. But to be cautious, the doctors may have considered it's safer to have actually admitted individuals into the hospital and then tested them further. However, one thing that Rosenhan did raise, and this is still relevant in modern society, is that psychiatric diagnosis carries an element of stigma, and therefore making people's lives more difficult. If they have a mental health diagnosis, it can limit their access to certain professions and certain jobs. And so the implications of misguided diagnosis are perhaps more serious than if you misguidedly diagnose a physical medical illness. Often that might be being sent for testing for a serious medical condition to eliminate it first and foremost. But when it comes to psychiatric diagnosis, it was evident that the admission into the hospital wasn't with the aim of eliminating schizophrenia, as they were all given a diagnosis of schizophrenia in remission, therefore still labelled with that particular mental health disorder. So the key implications within Rosenhan's conclusions is that the environment itself has a major impact on the process of diagnosis. So within the hospital environment, the staff couldn't tell mentally disordered from mentally healthy. And that's one of the issues with being sectioned or placed into mental health institutional care for diagnosis processes and procedures, that your behaviour becomes interpreted within the context of that environment, and that can influence the way in which people observe your behaviour, record your behaviour, and determine whether you have a mental health issue or not. The other key finding was that once you've been labelled with a condition, so for example schizophrenia in this case, it is very difficult to escape that label and be seen as normal. So none of the patients were ever seen as normal in that sense, hence why they had pseudonyms at the start of the study. So further information that you need to include with ROSENHAN's study is the fact he did a follow-up after he'd published his results from the Sane and Insane Places. And this came from sort of two different aspects. Firstly, ROSENHAN wondered whether the diagnosis of insane for sane people could be reversed. So how likely was a hospital to diagnose somebody who was insane as being sane, so doing things the other way around. Secondly, staff at one of the hospitals, which happened to be a teaching hospital, doubted the findings of ROSENHAN's first study. They said it was flawed and that they would actually be able to tell the difference between sane and insane. So in order to test this idea, ROSENHAN had told the hospital that in some time over the next 3 months, one or more pseudo patients would attempt to be admitted to their hospital. So he told them he was going to send one or more Confederates to come along to the hospital for diagnosis, and they had to decide which that person was. So each of the staff members at that particular hospital was asked to rate the patients that they saw within that 3-month period on a scale of 1 to 10. So they had to decide who was most likely to be the pseudo patient, so the person faking mental health illness. So in this case, the false information was the manipulated independent variable, and that false information is the fact that ROSENHAN didn't actually send a single pseudo patient to the hospital. The dependent variable was the number of patients that the staff actually suspected of being pseudo patients, even though he'd not actually sent any and they didn't know that. So in terms of the results of study 2, in total there were 193 patients admitted for psychiatric treatment in that 3-month period, all of which the staff gave judgments on. 41 were judged with high confidence by at least one member of staff to be the pseudo patient. So 41 out of the 193 the staff believed to be the pseudo patient, so the person faking their symptoms. 23 were considered to be a bit suspicious by at least one of the psychiatrists, and 19 were thought to be pseudo patients by one psychiatrist and one other staff member. So you've got the inter-observer reliability, multiple people suggesting that 19 of the 193 were pseudo patients. And of course ROSENHAN hadn't sent any pseudo patients whatsoever to this particular hospital, and therefore none of the 193 patients were faking their symptoms. So in order to review ROSENHAN's study before we go into the evaluation section, I'd like you to watch the following video, which is an interview with ROSENHAN himself. Make some notes around this and some of the key points that he raises. in order to develop the depth and understanding that you need. Again, if the video doesn't autoplay in this recording, please access it on Teams, and it is called a ROSENHAN interview, so you should be able to find that fairly quickly.
A different kind of criticism, but one that's just as provocative, has been leveled by David Rosenhan of Stanford University.
Between 1969 and 1972, a group of colleagues and I gained admission to psychiatric hospitals by faking a single symptom, which was that we said that we heard voices, and the voices said, empty, dull, thud. The moment we were admitted to the hospital, we abandoned our symptom, and we behaved the way we usually behave. The question was, would anyone detect that we were sane? The answer was, no. No one ever did. Admitted with the diagnosis in the main of paranoid schizophrenia, we were discharged with the diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia in remission. Now, in remission doesn't mean quite the same thing as sane. The term we use to describe the experience is dehumanized. Nobody talks to you. Nobody has any contact with you. The average contact of patients with staff was about 6.5 minutes a day. Nobody comes to visit. The first time I was in a psychiatric hospital, on an admissions ward with 41 men, my wife constituted 4 of the 7 visitors on a weekend. Psychiatric hospitals are storehouses for people in society whom you really don't want, whom you really don't understand, and for whom you've lost a great deal of sympathy. Staff need constantly to be reminded, and it's very hard to remind them. They are, after all, doing their best on the front end, but they need constantly to be reminded that the people who are their charges are not merely collections of symptoms. They are people with spouses, with children, with parents, with jobs, with mortgages and bills to pay, that they are, in the fullest sense of the word, very human and very unhappy.
So we're going to have a look at evaluating ROSENHAN's study. Make a note of the evaluation points that are coming up. However, you are going to have to expand these points to add the AO1 depth and detail for when you're producing essays, and also the sort of explain one strength, one weakness kind of questions in exams. It's a good skill to practice, and it helps you revisit the procedural aspects of his research and start to build those skills. That's also helpful for when you're looking at unseen material on a paper 2 and 3, so that you're able to find those evaluation points within unseen material yourselves. So I'm going to go through the first strength, which is given in a lot of detail. So it's going to highlight where your AO1 and your AO3 is and how much you actually need to include for a good, strong evaluation point. As you're going through the rest, please leave lots of space on your key study sheet after each strength and weakness. At the end of the lesson, we're going to have a look at the skill of evaluating evaluations, which is when you'll go back and add to your strengths and weaknesses that you've written down. So you need to leave a couple of lines space underneath each one, so you can go back to them, have a think about them, and add those evaluations to build up that AO3 skill, ready for your 20 mark essays, sorry. So we're going to have a look at this first strength so that you can see where the AO1 and the AO3 actually fit in. So the first 3 lines are your AO1 point. So within AO1, the same as when you do studies and theories from year 12, you need to point out what it was that was an actual strength of the study. All right, so what is it that Rosenhan did in this case that is a good thing, a strength, something that's going to make the study have strengths going forward. So the hospital sample selected was varied. So Rosenhan used old and new settings, private, public, well-staffed and poorly staffed hospitals in his sample, which are aspects that represent a range of US hospitals. That's your AO1 content. So you've linked it back to Rosenhan's study, so the different types of hospitals he used, specifically outlined there. And you've also said why that's a good thing, right? Because it represents a range of hospitals, so it's representativeness. So that's your AO1 identification of the strength or the good thing. You then need to develop that a little bit more to make that connection to AO3. So you need to tell the examiner why that point that you've just made is a strength. What is it about that that makes it a strength? So this is where your link to Graves comes in. So in the example in front of you, therefore, this makes the findings about admission to psychiatric institutions and the experiences of mental health care generalisable to other USA hospitals in the 1970s. You do have to be quite specific. Do not write, therefore, this makes his findings generalisable. You will get no marks for that brief inclusion of generalisability. You have to tell me what it is that is generalisable. So it's the findings about admission and it's the findings about experiences on the ward that can then be generalised to other hospitals in the USA in the 1970s. And again, be specific. What are you generalising to? You're not generalising to the whole world because all hospitals are different. You're not generalising across time because this was undertaken in the 1970s and a lot of things have changed. So be very, very clear to the examiner what it is that you're going to generalise and who it is, for example, that you're going to generalise to. So that's kind of your benchmark AO1, AO3 evaluation point. So I'm going to talk you through the other strengths and weaknesses, but like I said, leave some space. You're going to have to pad those out. I suggest you do that as you go along. So each time I go through a bullet point, pause the recording, use your pre-reading material and your notes from the interview and the overview video and stretch out those strengths and weaknesses, make them clear, make them detailed. And like I said, leave a little space underneath for when we get to the skill of evaluating evaluations. Okay, so one of the main strengths is that 12 hospitals were involved, which is a fairly good sample size for mental health institutions at the time. There weren't huge volumes of mental health institutions, so 12 is actually quite a good sample size, which means anomalies will be limited. So the effect of anomalies on the data is going to be reduced. For example, there were 11 occasions of a schizophrenia diagnosis and 1 occasion of bipolar disorder or manic depression, as it was referred to at the time. So that one anomaly in diagnosis doesn't have a massive impact on the fact that all 11 of the others were diagnosing schizophrenia. Okay, so remember, stretch that particular point out. If you want to pause now, add the detail, and then move on to the next one. The study was carried out in actual psychiatric hospitals using real staff who were unaware of the study, so it's got ecological validity. It was a real clinician doing the diagnosis, there were real psychologists on the ward, and it was real nursing staff and care staff who were interacting with the pseudo patients whilst they were in admission. So you've got the ecological validity because it represents real life experiences of psychiatric care and clinical diagnosis. By using 8 people in his confederates across 12 different hospitals, it meant that the study was replicated internally. So those people went to the first 8 hospitals with their standardised procedure, And for those who got out in time, they went to a further 4 hospitals, and each time it gives internal replicability of the standardised procedure for admission and the process of taking notes and gathering evidence once on the ward. The same results were found across them, therefore it gives the study reliability. So there is that reliability in terms of testing and retesting the procedure for admission, and reliability in terms of retesting the observation process. Obviously there's not inter-observer reliability, and you can come to that as one of your additional weaknesses, because there was only ever one person in each hospital. So it relies only on one person's review of the particular hospital itself. So by ensuring that an independent measures design was used, it meant that none of the hospitals underwent the study more than once. So they wouldn't have been able to guess the aims of the study, and there would have been no effect on the procedures they followed on the wards or during admission for diagnosis, because there would have been no order effects, and they wouldn't have been expecting a second person or a third person. They only took part once. Diagnosis itself was completed using a tested measure of mental health, so all diagnosis was done using the DSM, and therefore all patients were diagnosed using that particular classification system. So there's validity in the measure and validity in the test of diagnosis in that initial field experiment part of the study. All the Confederates had a scripted set of symptoms, so the words hollow, thud and so on. Using a standardised procedure for that admission at the field experiment stage makes the test of diagnosis reliable. It's been repeated. It was repeated in 12 different hospitals where they all followed the same procedure. So that element of reliability from retest of the admissions process gives reliability to that field experiment. Obviously the reliability doesn't then extend to experiences on the ward, because they're all in different wards undertaking different processes. So that element of the procedure couldn't be standardised, because all hospitals have different structures in place. They have different timings to the day, different expectations for how and when you have breakfast, lunch, tea, exercise time and so on. So it is just the admission process that has retest reliability. So the number of days that the pseudo-patient confederate stayed in the hospital is a numerical measurement. It's an objective measure of the length of their stay, so it gives objectivity to the findings. It's comparable. You can make comparisons between each hospital based on the number of days that those patients stayed in. Don't forget in these to add in that AO1. I want to know how many days, what was the average, what was the range of the days and so on. The fact that the pseudo patients could see what life was like from a patient's perspective adds validity. So that's the participant observation process, where they were on the wards following the rules and behaviours of the staff on the wards and engaging with day-to-day life of a patient in a mental health institution. It also gives depth and detail to the findings, so building on that validity, as it is a narrative and reflective account of what experiences were like. So it's quite a holistic view of time on a hospital ward. The findings themselves provided strong evidence of experiences in hospital at the time. So the process of labelling of the pseudo-patient confederates was clear. The way in which they were treated on the ward, the way in which people communicated with them, and the medical notes about their behaviours very clearly showed that labelling someone as insane changed the way in which they were perceived, and that idea that you suddenly become your mental health disorder because of the label, instead of being, you as an individual with a mental health disorder, was quite evident in the findings that Rosenhan gathered. The psychiatrists should really have been more careful in terms of their diagnosis at admission and also their diagnosis going forward. This carefulness is required really because ultimately you can have very serious consequences if somebody is labelled as mentally ill. One of the evidence pieces from the ward was that you are treated differently because of that label and because of that stigma, and that is reflected in the wider world. So one of the strengths of Rosenhan's study was that he raised the implications long term for patient care and for their life choices once labelled with a particular mental health disorder, and he brought that to the attention of the psychological community, whether that was psychiatrists, clinicians, nurses, or psychologists within the research communities of mental health. So some of the weaknesses of Rosenhan's study. The pseudo patients claimed they heard voices. So whilst this is not a standard symptom of schizophrenia on its own, auditory hallucinations are one of the requisites required to diagnose schizophrenia. Now, although there should be other symptoms alongside auditory hallucinations, it's not really surprising that most of those patients were diagnosed with schizophrenia, given the serious nature of schizophrenia as a mental health problem, and that hearing voices is one of the standard symptoms. Another weakness is that it doesn't explain why the patients weren't really found out to be sane. Although Rosenhan draws conclusions and judgments about labelling and the context of interpreting people's behaviour and the confirmation bias that if you are in a mental health institution, you have a mental health issue and therefore all your behaviours are related to that mental health issue, they are conclusions that he drew from a wealth of sort of holistic evidence. It isn't actually an objective rationalisation as to why each hospital didn't release those patients. Given the severity of schizophrenia, it may have been that they were being extra cautious and wanted to make absolutely sure that person was fine before they were released. Also, in terms of the second component to his study, again, we're looking at confirmation bias in this particular situation. So if the hospital was told that pseudo patients were coming and they had to decide which of the 193 patients were in fact fake, they are going to look for fake patients. It would be highly unlikely that the hospital would turn around and say none of them were fake. So they were looking to rate sort of least likely to be fake to most likely to be fake. And therefore that process by which they were lied to and told that fake patients were coming in would have informed their decisions about who they thought was most likely to be fake, as opposed to them coming back and saying none of them. Another weakness with Rosenhan is that it's over 40 years since Rosenhan's study was carried out. The vast majority of mental health institutions have quite considerably changed their working practices over that period of time. So his findings may not actually represent modern day hospital care. So arguably the findings about how people are dehumanised, how they are misdiagnosed, are essentially time locked into the 1970s. So they only really represent what happened at that point in time and in that particular country. There is now a great deal more emphasis on care in the community, so it may be wrong to conclude that mental ill health is still hard to spot. Most patients now will be living within a community, quite often independent or within supported living, and therefore no longer in institutional settings, and it may actually be much easier to spot sane versus insane when those people are involved within their normal community settings. The pseudo-patient participant observations, there's the element that they would have tried to be as objective as possible, but there would have been quite a considerable influence of subjectivity and particularly emotions. Most of those pseudo-patients, as we said before, wanted to leave the hospital immediately. They were not happy, they were not comfortable, and they did not like it. So that very nature of feeling emotionally insecure and a bit worried about being in the hospital could quite easily have influenced how they observed people's behaviour. So a lot of the negative recordings about the behaviour of nurses, the behaviour of staff, may have come from that emotional situation that the Confederates found themselves in. The Confederates themselves didn't represent a wide population of mental health patients. So one of the issues that we've sort of touched on and that we will be looking at in more detail is that there are very, very strong differences in the diagnosis of different groups of people. So Black and ethnic minority groups, for example, are more likely to be diagnosed with certain illnesses in comparison to white individuals. So because the Confederates only represented a narrow population of patients themselves, it makes it quite difficult to determine how admission would have been and how treatment on a ward would have been had those patients been of a wider social, ethnic and cultural background. Other issues with Rosenhan's study include the ethics. Hospital staff, whether that was at admissions or on the wards, were all deceived about the patient's symptoms during the admission process, and nobody on the wards knew they were taking part in a study, so nobody was able to give consent to the study taking place. Obviously, in Rosenhan's case, he did notify hospital management, but hospital management did not notify the staff on the wards or the staff at admissions. So nobody whose information is recorded was actually able to consent, and they were all deceived. In addition, there are wider ethical issues which relate to the actual patients on the ward. So as we know, a lot of those patients realised that the Confederates were not real patients, and for some of them that may have caused distress, and that could have posed a risk to their recovery and mental stability, because they wouldn't have understood why there was fake patients writing stuff down on their mental health ward. Another issue with the way in which the study was conducted is that all doctors, whether it is physical or mental illness, tend to play safe. So by default, you tend to consider the most serious diagnosis first and foremost, and you go through a process of ruling it out. You don't start from a simple diagnosis and work your way up. You rule out the major problems first and foremost. So instead of sort of looking at a patient and thinking, oh, you're faking your schizophrenia symptoms there, they're more likely to diagnose them and then check their behaviour. So this poses a problem with the admissions process and that field experiment component at the start, in that it is probably expected that clinicians will err on the side of caution. In addition, the study only represents mental health care hospitals in the USA. So it can't be generalised to a wider population because treatment, admission, time in hospital wards is very different. For example, in Japan, patients, particularly with schizophrenia in Japan, stay in hospital a very long period of time, but their care is much more structured and very different to hospitals in the USA. And you've got the cultural differences as well in terms of who is more likely to get diagnosed with schizophrenia depending on the countries that they live in. So the last little bit that I want you to talk to you about is this sort of year 13 skill of evaluating your evaluations. So this is the bit I want you to go back through your strengths and weaknesses and put an additional evaluation point on there. The reason you need to start to get into the practice of doing this is because it helps with your 20-mark essays. If you think of a 20-mark essay, it's about 45 minutes of writing. It's about 5 sides of A4. It's a big essay. So we need to be able to build in kind of heavier skills on the AO3 because the marks that are allocated in a 20-mark essay lean towards AO3 marks and less towards AO1. So it's not 50-50 split like your 8 markers would be. So we're going to practice the skill of being able to include AO1, AO3 and a bit more AO3. When you're going back to your strengths and weaknesses, you can add this additional AO3 in one of 2 ways. So you can develop your point with additional information that supports what you're saying, or you can develop your point with a counter argument, and that's the example that we've got in front of us. So if we go back to our first strength, which was looking at generalisability, you've got your AO1 for the first 3 lines there. So the hospital samples selected were varied. ROSENHAN used old and new settings, private, public, well-staffed and poorly staffed hospitals in his sample, which are aspects that represent a range of USA hospitals. So you've got your AO1, AO3. Therefore, this makes the findings about admission to psychiatric institutions and the experiences of mental health care generalisable to other USA hospitals in the 1970s. We're going to go on to add a further AO3 and we're going to do a counter argument here. So, however, even though there were a wide variety of hospitals sampled, these were located in only 5 USA states, so it can be argued that due to the nature of different medical care in the USA, the sample is not representative of all USA hospital care facilities, so reducing the generalisability of the data ROSENHAN found. So it's taking that second AO3 point and developing it. You need to give counter arguments or additional points that add to that paragraph. So you've got quite chunky strengths and weaknesses. Once you've gone back through all your strengths and weaknesses and added the additional AO3, so think about generalisability, reliability, validity, application, ethics, think about sample representativeness, think about designs, so independent measures and so on. Think about improvements. You can have that additional AO3 as something that you could make better. So, you know, is there a point that you've got in your strengths and weaknesses where you could talk about inter-observer reliability, for example? Also try and think about some of the issues and debates that we've considered. So the parts that are reductionist, the parts that are holistic, can you talk about how they can be developed and improved? You can include points such as issues around reliability and validity of the DSM. So you can go back to your evidence that you've looked at when we've done reliability and validity of the DSM and support any of your strengths and weaknesses with a piece of additional evidence. So that's another way that you can go about doing it. And you just need to build those particular points. So your homework is to go through those strengths and weaknesses that you've just written down and expand them. You can work together, you can do it independently, however you prefer, If you've got any problems with that, please put a post up on Teams and I can answer that as quickly as possible. But you need to have worked through that before we have our next lesson. So have a go at going through those. Add as many as you can. You might find it difficult to add to all of them, but try your best to add to the vast majority of them, because that will in the end make bigger essays much more straightforward. And the first 20-mark essay you are going to practice will be one on Rosenhan. So bear that in mind and get into the swing of doing this from this point on. So if you've got any questions, drop me a line, and if not, carry on with your homework and I will see you soon.